Hello, and welcome to Episode 2 of Sorastro's Runewars painting series, sponsored by Fantasy Flight Games and GTS Distribution. In this episode, we're going to paint the Carrion Lancer from Fantasy Flight Games' Runewars miniatures game. The Carrion Lancer is a wonderful miniature with some interesting anatomical features. As with Episode 1, this video is intended to share just one approach among many that you might take inspiration from when you paint your own. Additionally, some of the colours I've chosen for the Carrion Lancer, like we can see on this shield, I've picked to deliberately tie in with my chosen scheme for the faction, and I would encourage you to do the same. Let's take a look at the painting stages. I will once again be dry fitting the miniature together and providing some zenithal highlights just like we did for the Rune Golem in Episode 1. Next we'll apply the base colours, which will include a high contrast metallic gradation from black to bright silver for the carapace. I'll then be applying a selection of shades to the miniature to introduce some depth and make some heavy adjustments to the hue. We'll then provide some highlights, followed by some finishing touches which will include painting the boils, as well as providing a little object source lighting and applying some selective gloss varnish. Since I've prepared the miniature just as we did the Rune Golem in Episode 1, let's jump straight into applying the base colours. I'm going to begin by painting the carapace. The effect I want to achieve here is to produce a shimmering semi-metallic finish, a bit like the back of a beetle. To do this, I'm going to give each segment of the carapace a gradient using black, gunmetal and shining silver. The quickest way to do this is by wet blending the tones on the model itself. So I'm going to first deposit the three colours onto my palette, and I'm thinning each one with a little water and a couple of drops of Vallejo's glaze medium, which has a built-in retarder which slows the drying time. I'm then painting the outer edges of my first segment with pure black. I'm then giving the brush a quick clean before applying the gunmetal next to it. Notice I'm leaving a gap in the middle of the segment for the shining silver. Another quick wipe of the brush, and I can then blend the two together to create a smoother gradient. Finally, I'm going to add my shining silver to the middle of the segment, and once again, blend it into the adjacent tone. I'll carry on painting the rest of the segments in the same way. This is the slowest part of the process, and if you wanted a simpler, if less striking approach, you could simply paint the whole carapace with something like plain gunmetal if you prefer. We shouldn't worry if the transitions aren't always especially smooth, since we'll be applying some heavy shading to the carapace later on. It's the finished overall effect that we're most interested in. Having said that, there's nothing to stop you doing a little tidying up once the paint has dried. Next, I'm going to paint the fleshy underbelly of the beast using Citadel's Rakarth Flesh. I'm now going to use Vallejo's German Grey for the claws, mandibles and the shard-like protrusions. For the fabric we can see stretched across the Carrion's back, I'm using Castle Grey. I'm also using this for the inside of the shield and the shaft of the lance. For the particular metallic shade I was after for my faction, I'm mixing equal quantities of Citadel's Restributor Armour and Army Painter's Shining Silver. I'm using this for the rider's armour, as well as the seat and other metallic details. For the reins, I'm going to darken and desaturate some leather brown with some black, although most shades of dark brown will be fine here. Next, I'm going to paint the cloak and the shield using the main colour I selected for my Rakarth faction, Vallejo's Dark Sea Blue. I'm also going to create a lighter tone by mixing in a little white and some Scaly Hide, which I'm then going to wet blend with the base tone to create some areas of highlight. Here I'm applying the Dark Sea Blue, and I'm now roughly blending in some of the highlight tone. I'm now doing the same on the cloak and other areas of fabric. These colours and this approach isn't essential, of course. It just happens to be how I painted the rest of my army. You could use a single flat colour of your choosing instead. I'm now going to paint the skeleton using Brainmatter Beige. For the blade of the lance, I'm using gunmetal. And finally, I'm using Poisonous Cloud for the poison-filled maw and the tip of the tail. With the base colours complete, we're ready to do some shading. I'm going to begin by creating a 2-to-1 mix of Coelia Greenshade and Drakenhof Nightshade, which I'm then going to brush onto the carapace and the soft underbelly of the Carrion. After applying this to a few segments of the carapace, I'm going to take a moment to brush off the excess to ensure that the silvery highlights still show through. Once that's dry, which typically takes between 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to brush some Druchii Violet onto the darker outer edges of each segment of the carapace. This can be feathered out towards the centre with a damp brush. This is quite a simple step, and one you can also do if you've painted your Carrion with just a single metallic colour. The effect we're looking for is a subtle colour shift, something like what we find in nature on the hardened backs of some types of crab or beetle. Next, I'm going to create a 2-to-1 mix of Adrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil, which I'm then going to apply to the skeleton, along with all of the areas of metal and brown. The idea, of course, is that the shade is designed to settle more into the recesses, giving us a nice strong sense of contrast. Incidentally, this is the same shade mix I used for all of my infantry for both factions. I'm now going to use some pure Nuln Oil for the claws and shards. For the mandibles, I'm applying this selectively just to the facets I want to darken. Finally, I'm going to apply some Biel-Tan Green to the poisonous mouth and tail. With the shades applied, our Carrion Lancer is already looking good enough to game with, and if you're in a hurry to get your figure to the table, there would be nothing wrong with providing some basing and calling the miniature done. If you want to take your painting further, join me now as we add some highlights. I'm going to begin by highlighting the skin using a roughly equal mix of Rakarth Flesh and Ash Grey. This should give us a reasonable match to the naturally occurring highlights left by the shade. I'm keeping the paint reasonably thin, and I'm building the tone up in a couple of layers. I'm then going to lighten this by adding increasing quantities of mummy robes in a couple of stages. We can now apply slightly smaller highlights within those we've already added. I'm now using pure mummy robes for my brightest highlight. In between adding these last few highlights, I'm also going to apply some Druchii Violet to the more shadowed areas, which I'm thinning with Larmian medium in a roughly 2:1 ratio. I'm doing this to add some tonal interest, especially to the belly area. And here I'm adding my last few thin highlights. Next, I'm going to highlight the claws, shards and mandibles by mixing increasing amounts of white into the German grey. I'm pushing the highlights quite far on the mandibles to lay the groundwork for a simple bit of object source lighting. Here, I'd like to give the impression of a supernatural green light emanating from the mouth. So you can see I'm highlighting the edges and surfaces which we can imagine would catch the most light. We'll be adding the colour in a moment. Next, I'm going to reapply some Brainmatter Beige to highlight the skeletal rider. I'm focusing mostly on brightening the top of the skull and the raised facial features. For the metal areas, I'm providing a few small bright glints using an equal mix of bright gold and shining silver. We can also provide a few small highlights to the cloth and shield using the original highlight mix of dark sea blue with some scaly hide and white. For the harness, I'm using some Werewolf Fur. And I'm going to highlight the upturned surfaces of the lance blade with some shining silver. And finally, I'm going to use the original Poisonous Cloud to highlight the Poisonous Maw and tail. With the last of the highlights complete, we're ready to add some finishing touches. We're now going to paint the boils that we can see dotted around the body with some Commando Green. I'm then going to highlight these by mixing in some Scaly Hide. And I'm now using pure Scaly Hide. I'm going to give these highlights a final boost by mixing in a little Poisonous Cloud. Next, I'm going to thin some Poisonous Cloud down with at least an equal amount of water, and use this to colour the parts of the mandibles that look like they would receive light from the glowing maw. A bit like we did for the Rune Golem in episode 1. We can also do the same for the tail. I'm now going to pick out the skeleton's eyes with a spot of pure white. I'm then going to glaze the eye area with some Waywatcher Green to give them a slight green glow. The effect of this will be quite subtle, and you may like to apply more than one layer, both to the eyes and the surrounding area, to achieve a level of glow you're happy with. With the painting complete, we can now go ahead and protect the miniature with a matte varnish. I'm now going to apply some gloss varnish to some select areas. I'm thinning this with up to 50% water and brushing it over the carapace to create a hardened shine. We can also apply this to the poisonous slime to produce a wet look. We're now ready to prepare the base, and I'll once again be using a basing paste as detailed in episode 1. However, I've first chosen to glue the tray into the base. And now, when I apply the scenic paste, we can fill in the gaps to create a more seamless finish. I'm now going to dry brush the ground just as we did in the last episode, before applying some static grass. We're then ready to glue the model together and attach it to the base. And I'm once again going to stick down a few tufts of grass, this time using swamp and winter tufts. And this completes the Carrion Lancer. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the video and picked up some useful ideas that will help you when you come to paint your own Carrion Lancer. For a full list of products used, please see the video description, where you will also find links to my Facebook, Twitter and Instagram pages. For ideas on paint schemes for the other units in the game, I can recommend visiting the official Runewars forum, which you can also find a link to below. Join me again soon, and happy painting!